Is it more of a spiritual experience than a brain experience?
If there are, intelligences that we're interacting with it, my feeling is that they operate beyond the divisions that we create between the spiritual and the material.
You are a scientist, you're a computational neurobiologist, a chemical pharmacologist, a chemist, a writer, and you're primarily known for your pioneering work on DMT.
People normally refer to DMT as a psychedelic drug. If I describe a molecule that enters your brain, interfaces with your neural machinery, and allows you to communicate with otherwise invisible, unseen, hidden advanced intelligences, does that sound more like a drug to you, or does it sound more like a technology? Being turned, it opened its mouth, instantaneously shocked and astonished, as if God himself had opened his mouth. There's a real sense of movement, as if you're being propelled.
It could be that if you're barreling through something, is that it's the spiritual self that is barreling through it's leaving the body.
I mean, you could well be absolutely right here. I think we can only explain DMT if the brain is somehow gaining access to some alternate source of information. They grab your hand and say, let's go. And they show you hundreds and hundreds of different areas or rooms within the DMT space.
What is your percentage for this is internal versus your percentage for this is external?
In my own mind, I've been 100% sure since my first DMT experience.
Oh, wow. So this could probably be a little bit of a sensitive topic for my channel. So I want to just give a little bit of a introduction on what we're going to be talking about today. So it's been a topic that I've always wanted to explore on the show, just haven't had a chance to do it yet. So to have you in town is a super treat for me, because you're like literally one of the world's leading experts on this topic that we're going to discuss today. So tell me if I screw any of this up. You are Andrew Gallimore. You are a scientist. You're a computational neurobiologist, a chemical pharmacologist, a chemist, a writer, and you're primarily known for your pioneering work on DMT. And you first proposed the intravenous infusion model, which allows for prolonged states of consciousness under DMT, so that it could be studied further and more deeply, and so that we could understand it. I think that part of the mind-blowing aspect of this is that there's not scientific consensus as to what's actually happening when people use DMT. So we'll certainly get into that. But what we know happens is that users receive downloads of information and they interact with intelligent beings. And so the question is, and the question that you're attempting to figure out is this information and are these beings being created from within that individual's mind, or are they being linked up with something, or is it coming from an external source as opposed to an internal source? Are they real, the beings? Is the information coming to them from somewhere else, or is it internal? And the fact that there's not agreement on that yet, in and of itself, is pretty cool. So did I screw any of that up?
You nailed it.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Yeah, and I guess I would also add that, there are, with this substance, you could call it a substance, you could call it a medicine, you could call it a gateway to other dimensions or other realities. You could call it a compound, all sorts of things. You could call it a drug. Mm-hmm. But with this substance, it is also known to and scientifically proven to cure specific mental conditions, such as, certainly help with specific mental conditions, such as complex PTSD, depression, anxiety, addiction, like alcoholism or addiction to drugs. So there are significant benefits to it as well from a scientific standpoint and from a medicinal standpoint. So I think that's a fascinating thing that people don't really understand about DMT and about psilocybin and potentially other psychedelics is the potential medicinal positives. Although with things like ayahuasca, where DMT is an active ingredient of ayahuasca, I think that's becoming more and more common knowledge that people realize that people are healing through the use of these substances. So decent little intro. Did I screw anything up?
That's perfect.
Okay. All right. Awesome.
Covered all the bases.
Okay. All right. Cool. Well, good, man. Yeah, it's good to have you here. And I guess that's the big question, right? Like, what is it? Is it being created internally through the mind somehow, or is it an external kind of a download?
It's a big question. I mean, as you said, right, the idea that there isn't consensus. I mean, okay, there are scientists that will say, of course, it's just hallucination, right? You're hallucinating. This is a powerful psychoactive drug, and it's perturbing your brain, and it's causing it to make things up, fabricate these highly complex, hyperdimensional worlds filled with non-human, non-animal, intelligent beings that are beyond the human, operating within worlds that are far more complex, far more advanced, hyper-technological worlds. And for me, that's a very kind of facile explanation. When I first smoked DMT, like more than 20 years ago, for me personally, like 30 seconds into that first experience, I knew that this was not just my brain making it up. It was undeniable to me personally. There was no possibility of denying that I was interfacing with some kind of timeless, thoroughly alien intelligence. But of course, that's private revelation, I guess. I don't expect people to understand that, to believe it. There's a lot of it that is, as Terence McKenna would say, un-Englishable about the experience. Right. One of my favorite lines from Terence McKenna was, "A secret is not something untold; it is something which cannot be told." And there's certainly an element of that with DMT, in that you kind of have to see it. You have to go there to understand why I've spent the last 2 decades of my life devoted to this molecule, because it remains, in my opinion, a true enigma. There are very few true mysteries. Well, maybe that's a bit unfair, but certainly I think the idea that you can inhale a couple of lungfuls of one of the most common naturally occurring plant alkaloids that's found in countless plant species, and you are almost guaranteed an audience with intelligences that exceed your imagination, something you could not predict or anticipate. I think that is an incredible thing. So my kind of, the way I work is to say, okay, let's look at the more mainstream orthodox explanations first of all. So I don't want to kind of jump to the conclusion that this is an advanced intelligent agent from beyond our brains, or perhaps even beyond our universe, because that's a very hard sell. So I always say maybe 80% of what I do is analyzing, deconstructing, and attempting to eliminate alternative models for what is actually happening with DMT. So I can kind of if you want me to, I can get into a little bit technical, but I can kind of get into how my thinking has evolved on that subject, if you'd like that.
Yeah, that would be great, for sure. Yeah. I mean, what you're saying is that it's an experience, and it's not something that can really be put into words. And I totally get that. Like with a lot of these experiences, I think that the people who are having the experience with a psychedelic have a difficult time explaining to other people what it was like, but they know that it was one of the most profound experiences that they've ever had in their life, or if not the most profound experience that they've ever had in their life. So, but totally get it that it's difficult to put it into words. What was it about that initial experience for you specifically that was like, I'm going to dedicate my life to understanding what's actually going on here?
First of all was the inordinate complexity of this space. It wasn't just, I was expecting, I mean, I'd read everything by Terence McKenna. I'd listened to the lectures, I'd read the trip reports. So in my head, I was prepared, right? I knew what I was going to get. But that wasn't what I got.
Not so much, yeah.
And it shocked me. I mean, the book, Death by Astonishment, comes from Terence McKenna's line. The only risk with DMT is death by astonishment, because it is physiologically innocuous. It's very at home in the human brain, which is also kind of interesting. But astonishment, I think, is one of the rarest of emotions. Very, very rarely do people experience what you would call true astonishment, and DMT delivers it on tap. This incredible complexity. It was clear that the world, in that moment, it was clear that this was a world that had been constructed. Graham Hancock, who's also been on, you've spoken to, in his book Supernatural, describes it as constructed, inorganic, and in essence technological. That's exactly the vibe that I got. This was a constructed world that was constructed by the hand of something intelligent. That was just so obvious to me that it wasn't just complex geometric imagery. It was an impossible world. It's a world that could not exist in this reality. And there was I didn't see any entities in my first experience. People describe, and we can get into the types of entities that people see. I didn't see any entities, but I felt the presence of this immense intelligence, and it was so far beyond human intelligence and clearly not human, a thoroughly alien type of intelligence that seemed to be both billions of years more advanced than us, but also billions of years older, as if it'd always been there, and that I was suddenly confronted with this intelligence. And as you can imagine, it's shocking. And so I decided at that point, I laid on my bed shaking to my bones, and all I could say for the next 10 minutes was, "Oh my fucking God." Just repeating, that's all I could say. I was so thoroughly astonished and shocked by what had happened to me. And I knew this is, I have to get to the bottom of this. What is this? What is this? And so then I started looking at the neuroscience. So I started looking at I graduated from Terence McKenna lectures to the scientific literature. Naively, in retrospect, kind of expecting that I'd find all of these scientists throwing up their hands and going, "Oh my God, this is the next great mystery to be solved by mankind." But that's not what I got. I got, this is a short-acting psychedelic with the propensity to induce visions of entities. As if that itself wasn't kind of remarkable. Mm-hmm. But, non-human, non-animal entities, intelligent beings. And I thought that isn't easy to explain, actually.
It's probably not remarkable if you haven't experienced it.
And that's part of the problem. So I was interacting with some guy on Twitter, X, whatever.
Which I haven't experienced it, just for the record.
Right,
and
okay.
It's freaking remarkable to me. So it's possible to actually, think that there's something here that we need to figure out what's going on.
Right. Yeah. So this guy called entity encounters illusory social events, which which I thought is just the weakest, most appraisal of these beings, like you. I don't know. I just thought that was kind of ridiculous. It's just silly to dismiss them as that. But once you do that, once you say, oh, these are visual hallucinations, these are illusory social events, then you can neatly slot them into various phenomenological categories. This is a type of visual hallucination. But you run into problems, right, when you try to do that. Very few people have really tried to actually analyze these alternative hypotheses. So hallucination. First of all, what is a hallucination? Kind of my axiom that I always work from. I always try to root everything I do in neuroscience. I don't fly off and say, oh, could these be demons, or could these be spirits of the departed, and things like this. Because once you do that, you've unmoored yourself from science and you're into the mystical, which is fine if that's your thing. But I always wanted to try and explain and demonstrate that DMT is a true problem for science to explain. It is not easy to explain. And I did that by starting from, okay, what is the world, right? We all experience a world. From the moment you're dragged squealing from your mother's womb, you are immersed within a world. We call it reality, the normal waking world. So what is that, first of all? Well, it's a model. It's a model constructed by your brain. From the moment you arrive in this reality, your brain is sampling information from the environment, sensory information through the eyes and the ears, etc. And it is trying to find patterns in this sensory information, and it is using this information to construct this model of the environment. The world that you experience is always this model. It's always being constructed by your brain. Yes, there is a mapping between this model and whatever is going on outside your brain, but the world you experience is always constructed by your brain. Your brain has learned and evolved to construct this model. It's the only world your brain knows how to build, or it's the only world your brain should know how to build. And that applies under all circumstances. So whether you're normal waking life, when your brain is kind of testing its model continuously against sensory information to keep it stable and kind of tuned to the environment, or when you dream. When you dream, most people, most of the time, their dreams look like the normal waking world. Yes, they're more fluid and dynamic, and they shift from scene to scene because the brain doesn't have access to sensory inputs to keep it tuned, basically. But the dream world, your brain is using what it learned to construct in the waking world. Dream characters. Most dream characters are other humans. Animals, dogs, cats, maybe horses if you like riding horses, right? If you go to the Amazon and interview people about their dreams, they won't dream of horses.
Jaguars.
Right. Stingrays, whatever, right? The animals they meet in the environment. Even psychotic hallucinations. Most people, if they suffer from schizophrenia, what are their hallucinations? Normal-sized, normal-appearing people. Normal-sized, normal-appearing animals. There's nothing particularly remarkable here. The brain is simply drawing on what it knows, what it's learned about how to construct this model. So then we have a bit of a problem. When you smoke DMT, something inexplicable, in my opinion, happens, right? So psychedelics, how do they work? Well, they get into the brain, they bind to this specific receptor that stimulates the brain. So neurons, these information-generating cells in your brain, they start firing more, they become more active, they start sharing information more freely. So the brain enters this kind of more fluid and dynamic state. You can see this in an MRI scanner, often referred to as an entropic state by Robin Carhart Harris at San Diego. And so the world goes from being kind of stable and predictable to being much more fluid and dynamic, right? You go from order to disorder. But with DMT, something else happens. You go from order, the normal waking world, to disorder, and then it kind of collapses into this entirely new order. When I say entirely new, I really mean entirely new. Like nothing has been taken from the normal waking world and brought into this DMT world. It is a world that is disjoint from normal waking reality. It is not filled with humans, not filled with dogs and cats and horses. It is filled with entirely alien, intelligent beings occupying a space that is described as hyperdimensional, contains more directions than normal waking world. Beings that are incredibly, clearly intelligent, manipulating the space, constructing higher dimensional objects in front of you and manipulating them and saying, look at this, look at this. And to me, the question is, how is that possible? It's like the brain is speaking a language it never learned to speak. It's as inexplicable as a 5-year-old British child suddenly switching from English to, Siberian Yupik or some other exotic language that he never learned to speak. It's that inexplicable, if not more so. And so for that reason, I don't think you can dismiss DMT as hallucination. I think the only way we can explain it, this is the point I've gotten to after, a couple of decades. I think we can only explain DMT if the brain is somehow gaining access to some alternate source of information that can kind of enter the brain, flow into the brain, and essentially commandeer the brain's world-building apparatus. I always say you don't break through into the DMT world. The DMT world breaks through into you. You're not going somewhere as such. Somehow DMT is gating access to some kind of intelligent agent that is directing information into your brain and effectively controlling what you see. It is directing the construction of this highly altered world model, which you experience as the DMT world and all of its residents, so to speak.
So what you're saying is there's no way possible that the human brain could be creating these realities because it doesn't have within it, maybe it's possible, but you think it's unlikely that the brain has within it the information necessary to create the reality.
That's what I lean towards, and there are a number of specifics that I can point to. So I'll give you an example. So the last time I was in the States, actually, when I flew back, I was back in Tokyo, terrible jet lag. For some reason, when I get jet lag, I get a lot of lucid dreams. And I was dreaming, and I knew that I was dreaming, and I was on this beautiful green hillside, and there were hundreds and hundreds of dogs running down the hillside. And I thought to myself, I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to really have a look at these dogs. I'm going to get real close. And I got right in the face of one of these dogs. And the words that came into my head were, those are shit dogs. Those aren't very good dogs, right? And there's a good reason for this, right? It's a good way to test, actually, if you're dreaming, is to really look closely at things, because the way that your world model is constructed is like a hierarchy. So information comes through the senses normally to the back of the brain, the primary visual cortex. This is where the fine details, rapidly changing details of objects in the world are kind of being modeled. Higher up in this hierarchy, which is kind of more forwards in the brain, you have kind of high-level object models. So you might have a high-level dog model It's not a specific dog. It's just a kind of a sketch, an outline of a dog, if you like. And right down at the back in the primary visual cortex is where the fine details are being modeled, which are highly dependent on a flow of sensory inputs. Now, of course, in the dream state, your brain doesn't have that sensory input, so it can't create, it's much more difficult for it to create fine details of specific things in the environment. It can only create a very kind of what we call a high level, broad, general dog. And that's what it uses in the dream state. You don't notice this if you don't recognize that you're dreaming. So things are kind of quite broadly and generally sketched in the dream state, because your brain is relying on these stored high-level models, these general models. It doesn't have access to sensory inputs. So
it makes shit dogs.
It makes shit dogs, right? And anything else, right?
Right.
And so what's striking for me, and also actually as another aside but relevant, is during psychotic hallucinations, there's very little activity in the primary visual cortex. So what that shows basically, when psychotics are hallucinating, they're using these stored high-level, broad models to construct their hallucinations, right? Hallucinations are just objects incorporated into the world model that aren't properly mapped to sensory inputs, basically. So, anyway. So what's interesting in the DMT state is that the world is extremely detailed. It is not built from kind of stored object models, high-level models. It seems to be not just detailed, but far more detailed, far more complex than the normal waking world.
So lucid dreams are dreams that you have, and you know that you're dreaming, and so you're able to interact with things within your dream.
Exactly.
Were you able to have those sorts of dreams prior to your psychedelic experiences?
Yeah, since I was a kid, I've had lucid dreams sporadically. I'd normally at school. I didn't have the dream at school, but I'd dream of being at school, and I'd recognize that I was dreaming, but sporadically, kind of, I can't generate them like some people can. But yeah, I started having them more when I have jet lag for some reason. So that's something to look forward to when I go back to Tokyo next week.
That's a gift. I've always wanted to try lucid dream. I think I've had one in my life.
And when you actually put someone who's taken DMT into an fMRI scanner, what's really interesting is that you can, normally when someone is viewing the world with their eyes open, you can actually see kind of waves of electrical activity flowing from the primary visual cortex kind of forward. So this is the sensory information flowing into the brain and through the brain, basically, as your brain is processing that information and using it to maintain its world model. When someone closes their eyes, that flow stops. So you get this closed eye, open eye, you see the flow of waves, and then it drops back down when they close their eyes again. Now, what happens when you inject someone with DMT, do you think?
I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you. So when you inject someone with DMT, it's indistinguishable from normal visual sensory input. So you start to see information flowing from the primary visual cortex, even if their eyes are completely closed. So they're not receiving sensory inputs. It looks as if, they are seeing with their eyes shut. You're seeing information flowing from the primary visual cortex up through the levels of the cortex.
Is it amplified in any way, or?
It's exactly like they're seeing with their eyes shut. And this has been shown with ayahuasca by a guy called Jordi Rieber. A similar kind of study back in the 90s, and more recently by Imperial College London. Now, the explanation there is, this is just system noise. It's spontaneous patterns of cortical activity. Now, to me, that doesn't make any sense, because these DMT worlds, this isn't just spontaneous cortical activity. These are highly agentic alien intelligences that are highly interactive and are manipulating this highly complex, higher dimensional space, highly technological. So the idea that this is just spontaneous neural activity just seems ridiculous to me.
So when people are seeing these things, so it's not as if, so you take DMT, smoke it or whatever, you vape it, and then it's not as if you're moving around and interacting with the world around you. You're sitting down, you're incapacitated, right? And so you might have like a thing over your eyes, covering up your eyes potentially. So when you're seeing and interacting with, and you mentioned like an intelligence that is showing you something, some bit of technology or information, and it's like, wow, look at this. Like what are you, I guess maybe if you can even start the process from when you enter into this world, like immediately, what does it look like? How do you get there? What's the transition like, if any, or are you just bang right there? How does that transition start first? And then maybe I have some other questions about it.
Yeah, so it normally progresses through a number of phases. So the first phase is this rush, this overwhelming procession of highly complex geometric imagery. Some people describe it as like being fired through a cannon. I think it was either Alan Watts or Timothy Leary. It gets confused, but it described it as being fired through a cannon with Neo-Byzantine barreling. Just there's a real sense of movement, as if you're being propelled through. Now that in itself is overwhelming, shocking, astonishing.
Let's pause on that for a second, if we could.
Sure.
So do you feel like that is, where do you think that the center of consciousness is the brain? Do you think that this is all brain, or do you think there's a spiritual component to life?
That is a deep question.
Yeah.
And the answer is I don't know. What I try to do is, as soon as I start to talk about, even just talking about consciousness, you start to run into some deep philosophical problems. I focus on structure, content, dynamics. I know, I can show, anyone can show, that I can't tell you why we have subjectivity. Why is there something it's like to be me? Or why is there something it's like to be you? Which I also can't prove. But what I can show is that the structure, the information contained within your experienced world is represented in your brain. If you suffer from a stroke, for example, that knocks out a certain part of the visual cortex that's responsible for generating color information, then your world becomes monochrome. It's called achromatopsia. It's a rare but very real condition. There's also a condition called akinetopsia. If you selectively destroy the part of the cortex that represents movement information, then you see the world as a series of still images. I can't imagine what's that must be like. You can manipulate, I can zap your brain and generate spontaneous perceptions. Or you can take LSD and it will manipulate your neural activity and the world will change. So the information, the content, the structure, and the dynamics, everything, all the information contained in your subjective world is represented in your brain. Why that information has the property of subjectivity, subjective consciousness, it's a very different question. So I sidestep that. I avoid that because I don't need to deal with that when I'm talking about the world.
You might need to deal with it if like to really understand this phenomenon, though. So it could be that, for example, it could be that if you're barreling through something, if you feel like you're in this state of barreling through, and I'm not saying this is what happened, I'm just saying possibility potentially, is that it's the spiritual self that is barreling through it's leaving the body. It's still, maybe quantumly entangled with the brain and the physical body, but potentially that, could be a way that this, and total just ridiculous speculation, but it feels like that understanding the nature of like what is life even could help maybe solve some of the questions about what's happening here.
I mean, you could well be absolutely right here. I always frame it in the opposite direction, as if it's as I said, gating the flow of information into the brain. So it's that rush of information that's flowing into the brain, which generates that flood, that rush, that overwhelming rush of complex imagery. Is basically the brain starting to receive information that it didn't normally have access to. So it's that transition between the normal waking world and the DMT world. That's kind of this roller coaster phase. Now, in most people, if they don't smoke enough, that will be the end of the experience, and it's worthwhile just doing it for that. But if you take enough, then there's this transition, like a threshold, described by DMT users as breaking through, where you seem to pass through some kind of veil. There's this transition from the complex imagery into what's quite obviously another world, which is very coherent. It is operating with razor sharp precision. It's a truly astonishing thing when it happens, because it's like 30 seconds before you were in the normal waking world, 30 seconds later, and you're in a world that is completely unlike normal waking world. And I think this transition, I think, is when the brain is kind of settling into the constructing, it collapses down. I described earlier this shift from order to disorder, back to this new order. That transition, that collapse into the new order, is when the brain is constructing, or is being induced to construct, this alternate world model. And I propose that this is a directed world. It's a world that is the result of the brain having been seized control of or commandeered by some kind of intelligent agent, which is directing everything that you see.
And how many times, quick question, have you been to this and seen this world?
Dozens.
Okay. And so, like, describe it. Is it always different? Is it like what? How would you describe it?
It's always different, but the ambience for me personally is always the same. So there's instantaneous recognition of, oh, I'm back. Here we go again. Sometimes there have been occasions where I enter what seems to be a dark, subterranean, domed kind of space that is clearly not of Earth. Very, very strange. With the walls are painted with strange, complex imagery. And one particular experience, I remember floating, it seemed to be towards this hooded being which had a staff and was kind of stirring not water, but reality, which makes no sense. I understand, right? To English that, but I understood that's what this being was doing, and the being turned and looked at me and recognized I was there. So I had a face-to-face audience with this being, and I said in my head, which I regretted soon after, I said, okay, show me what you've got. I want to see it. And all I recall was the being kind of its face right there above me. And then it opened its mouth. And that's all I recall, because at the moment I was just instantaneously shocked and astonished, as if God himself had opened his mouth, is how I always describe it. And it shook me out of the experience, and I sat bolt upright, shaking like, oh my God, I can't describe what I saw. But whatever I saw then, my brain has repressed that or something. I don't know, but I can't remember it. So that was kind of a unique experience in that it was quiet. It was so quiet in that place, just that being. Other
And
times
is it like
wild.
was it outside? Was it
No.
like was it inside? Was it
It was inside. I would describe it like a dark cavern or cave or something like this. That's how it felt. Other times it's
the walls? Could you see like what would the walls like look like?
the walls seemed quite dark and yet alive in some way. I mean, there's clearly a lot going on, geometric imagery, but it wasn't like often the DMT experience is it's very technicolor, extremely bright, extremely complex, like beings that are constructing and manipulating and assembling and disassembling objects and vast structures in several dimensions at lightning speed. It's like, wow. And sometimes there's a feeling of a tour. Like they grab your hand and say, let's go. And they show you hundreds and hundreds of different areas or rooms within the DMT space. Like, we've only got 3 or 4 minutes. Let's do this. Yeah. And it's wild. And I struggle. This is one of the reasons I kind of developed this, or the original idea for DMTX, this extended state DMT came from, is that it's so fast. It's very difficult to bring back information. Some people are very good at it. Many of Rick Strassman's subjects in the 1990s, when he was injecting them with DMT, he got some great reports from that. It's a mine, it's a gold mine of trip reports, all carried out in a very kind of clean and standardized setting. So I focus a lot on the primary portal to the qualities of subjective experience are the reports of people. That's what we've got to go on, I think.
What's the most memorable entity that you haven't talked about yet publicly?
Personally, in one occasion, it was actually a group of entities that really scared me. I was in what appeared to be some kind of, sounds a bit ridiculous, but like a boardroom of sorts, where there were a number of beings sat around like a convocation of some sort. And it was impressed upon me that they had control of our reality. And they were discussing or debating whether or not to flick the switch, to switch us off. They decided not to, fortunately, I guess. But that, I guess what jolted me deeply about that experience was just the understand. Now, do I really think that they were really contemplating switching off the simulation or something like that? Probably not. But I think it was a message in a way, as if to say, we're in control here. You're not the top of the tree when it comes to intelligence. Humans don't even register on the scale of intelligence when it comes to these beings. There are beings that are so vastly beyond the human that it's just no point even discussing it. I mean, it's incomprehensible, the level of advancements of these intelligences, I think.
So what those specifically, what did they look like?
I don't recall.
Okay.
No. They weren't humans. I'm not one of these, I wish I was, but one of these people that can go into this space and bring out really fine details. Some people are really good at it. They can tell you exactly what happened from the beginning of the trip to the end of the trip. But I guess my brain just doesn't work that way.
So you mentioned simulation. Maybe we cover that real quick. I mean, I guess the question is, and I just had Riz Verk on on the show. Fascinating conversation about simulation theory, but curious about your thoughts there. I'd imagine that for a computer scientist or a computer engineer, it's easy to create kind of a reality where you could explore the possibility or the potential that this is just a simulation. It's some quantum computer simulation, and there's these. It's run by potentially advanced, beings from within our own universe, potentially, or a different universe if this one's not real. Um, how does that kind of stack up, that concept versus, because I don't think he's experienced these things that you've experienced, but how does that stack up against the reality of what you're seeing? Do you feel like simulation theory could be a possibility?
Um, I struggle with the term simulation, first of all, because simulation of what? A simulation must always have a simulated, a real counterpart. So it assumes that there is some base reality that is being simulated, and I don't really get that impression. Certainly with DMT, there are aspects of the DMT experience that seem very digital. It's clearly and full of code as well. So many people describe seeing code-like imagery in the DMT state, but at the same time, this simulation thing seems, don't take this the wrong way, but it seems almost mundane. There's nothing about the DMT experience, in my opinion, that would suggest a kind of simple explanation for reality that it was being simulated. It seems, I don't necessarily believe that we are even capable of comprehending the true nature of reality, and the idea that we've stumbled on the correct model for reality as it's a simulation, just like simulations we run on computers. I think it's very anthropocentric. Of course, we live in a computer age, we live in a digital age, technological age, and yes, people are going to, before, 100 years ago, they would have described a clockwork universe, maybe a bit more than 100, but you get the point, right? And so now it's, the idea is that we live in a simulated reality, but I think DMT, it seems to hint at or impress upon you or force you to confront, I would say, a reality that is truly far stranger than we can suppose. So I don't really think, I think all of our models are probably way off the mark. And you're forced to kind of face that, how little we know about the true nature of reality, because all of your fundamental ontological assumptions are kind of extirpated within an instant, and everything you thought you knew about how things are, how things work, it's all gone.
Is there a consistent message that has been delivered to people or to you, or is it just seemingly random?
So what's very common is when people enter the space, there's clearly an awareness of these intelligences that there is limited time available, and they are keen to show you things. Most of the time, in my opinion, it's more like a performance. Their intention is not to kind of give you a specific message. Right? People always say, where are the blueprints for the time machine, man? And that kind of thing. And I just don't think, again, it's a very human-centric way of looking at it, that they are there to kind of show us things, very earthbound technologies. And I don't get that impression at all. Most of the time, they are performing for you. They are showing you what's possible. They're showing you that things are possible that you assumed weren't possible. The message being, it's not a verbal message, but it's a clear message of you don't know shit about what's actually going on. And this is why I think, with the machine elves, by far the most famous residents of the DMT world.
Also the most common or just the most famous?
I would say both.
Okay.
Not the most common type of entity, but certainly one of the most commonly described. And this goes back, the machine elves, people will blame Terence McKenna for the machine elves, but elf-like beings, small, multitudinous, lively, giggling, jovial beings that kind of come bound into the space and do things for you, whether it's singing impossible objects into existence or just kind of manipulating.
Singing impossible objects.
Right.
Wow.
That doesn't make any sense, right?
It makes perfect sense.
That's Dennis McKenna's phrase, singing impossible objects into existence, which you can't imagine.
Yeah.
A 9-dimensional Fabergé egg, I think sort of Terence McKenna would describe it, but that kind of thing. And clearly the message here, and sometimes it's like devices, that's also very common. And this goes back, Timothy Leary, when he first smoked DMT in the 1960s, he saw these, he described them as radiant elf insects. They were kind of proffering this jewel-encrusted pad, this technological device with buttons and sliders and and kind of showing it to him as if to say, go on, work this out, and of course he couldn't make any sense of it. But that's kind of common. And sometimes, they will place these objects right in front, covering your field of vision. One of Rick Strassman's subjects, Spiros, described what he described as a reality synthesizer, which he couldn't get past with all these dials and knobs, and he was trying to make sense of it, which of course he couldn't. He just knew it was a reality synthesizer. How you imagine that, I don't know, but he knew that for some reason. So they broadly, I think, they're trying to show us that, yes, we don't know anything. We don't know anything. And that, in my opinion, is kind of the most important message for humans to accept, I think. I think maybe that's something we need to take to heart, is that we don't know shit about what is, about reality. And we're not ready for the blueprints for the time machine or the solutions to the unified field equations and that kind of stuff. I think people just assume that that's what a highly advanced species would do, but I couldn't explain to a dog quantum theory or relativity or something. It's just impossible. So the idea that, and I think that the distance between, in terms of intelligence, between dogs and humans is much smaller than humans to these intelligences. So the idea that they can kind of give us the lowdown on reality, I just don't think it's possible. So perhaps it's going to require us to transcend or progress much further in our cognitive evolution, technological sophistication before we get the kind of messages that we were expecting to get.
Yeah, I want to go back to the entities in a second and the types of entities, but so for me, and I mentioned this at dinner last night as if it was something that you'd considered yet, and it goes back to like their intelligence, and this is me knowing nothing about this situation and like never having experienced this. Totally get that, but I would just invite you to consider, as someone who has experienced this possibility, and that possibility has to do with the Schumann resonance. And the Schumann resonance it contains all of the information that has ever existed on the planet Earth. And so when you're talking about intelligence, I mean, you're talking about all of the information that has ever existed in the history of the planet Earth and potentially beyond the planet Earth. And if you could somehow become connected with the Schumann resonance, then you can be connected with any bit of information that's ever existed. And so could your brain, through the use of DMT, actually be somehow, in some way, in addition to the other things that are happening within your brain? And I know that there's other pathways being stimulated and all of that, but But what DMT has been proven to do is to change the frequency of the human brain in hertz to lower than, I think it's the beta frequency that we operate between 10 and 12 hertz, and it drops it right to 7.83 hertz into the, I guess it's the, might be getting this wrong, Ryan could look it up.
You're down in the alpha
but the
range.
alpha, right. So in that 7.83 is the exact frequency of the Schumann resonance. So is that a coincidence that we're connecting with this frequency of electromagnetic energy that has been trapped between the surface of the Earth and the ionosphere since the beginning of time? And of course, light contains information. This is how we send information from satellites down to the Earth. This light has been bouncing up and down at 7.83 hertz for hundreds of millions of years. And so with the human brain moving to that frequency, could that connection with these infinitely intelligent beings, could there be some connection there that's making this download of information possible to the human brain?
Well, it's a hypothesis. My next question as a scientist would be, well, how are you going to test that hypothesis? Can you isolate someone from this resonance? Can you, I don't know whether a Faraday cage or something would work. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar so much with the Schumann resonance, but if you can think of a technique that would isolate the human brain from that resonance and that would then diminish the DMT experience or not allow you to kind of access these realms, well, then you've got a good test for your hypothesis. I think at this point,
and I have to give credit to Stephen Burns for this. He's a brilliant guy. I had him on the show. He's a good friend of mine, and he's the one who he made a video on it. I think he had to take it off of his website, or his YouTube page. But I got to give credit to him. That's all I wanted to say, because it's his original idea.
I mean, fair enough. I mean, look, I think it's part of a broader question, which is, if I'm correct in that I'm proposing there is some alternate source of sensory information that's not coming through the normal conduits, that of course raises the question, well, what is that source of information? Where is it coming from? How is it accessing the brain? Is it through this Schumann resonance that you describe? Is it through something else? Are we talking about post-biological super advanced post-biological intelligences that have transcended the material form, that are instantiating themselves at the lowest ground of reality, what John Barrow, the English cosmologist, would describe as omega minus civilizations that have found a way to instantiate themselves in the basic computational substrate of space-time? And are they accessing the brain, perhaps from the lowest level? So information is not just kind of flowing through the brain, but information is always flowing. You have this bidirectional flow of information from the ground of reality itself upwards through the different levels of organizational complexity, from the basic structure of space-time up through the quantum and the subatomic and the atomic and the molecular, and then these highly complex molecular networks that we call cells, and then complex networks of cells or neurons that we call a brain. I mean, you have levels of complexity, and information is always flowing, not just within, information isn't just flowing within these neural networks of the brain, but information is also flowing down through these levels of complexity. So if you can inject information at the lowest end, i.e., the ground of reality itself, if these intelligences exist there, then you can imagine them having kind of a back door, if you like, to our brain, or bottom door, however you want to describe it. And the information is coming up through there. That, to me, is the most sensible. I might be wrong here. Anything goes. You can posit various explanations, I think, and I don't think at this point we're in any position to favor one explanation over another, because I don't think we have any way of testing that kind of thing. all I do is try to convince people that the other more mundane explanations of hallucinations or exotic dream imagery kind of fail. So we have to start thinking about
what could it be?
What could it be?
What could be happening? Like from a scientific standpoint, yeah, for sure. Yeah, that this Schumann resonance thing is for me makes a lot of sense. But and I mean, could the entities themselves be? I mean, if that is electromagnetic energy, could they be life forms or electromagnetic energy themselves? You know, is it more of a spiritual experience than a brain experience? You know, I know we can't test that, so I know it's difficult to talk about, but it's just if they're able to interact within this electromagnetic field of the Schumann resonance, which is all pervasive and everywhere. I mean, could this spiritually be something where you, not the brain, but the spirit is actually moving and connecting with beings on that field of electromagnetic energy of consciousness potentially?
Well, I think I don't necessarily draw a sharp line between the spiritual and the brain. That's what people tend to do. And again, as soon as you do that and say, oh, this is a spiritual phenomenon rather than a brain phenomenon, you're kind of ruling out the role of the brain in mystical experience. All mystical experiences in some way involve the brain, and that's the primary tool that we use to experience. So I don't think these beings, if there are intelligences that we're interacting with, I think my feeling is that they operate beyond the divisions that we create between the spiritual and the material or kind of the brain level stuff. I think you're always using the brain to experience, to construct the world, and I think if there is, if you do posit the existence of advanced intelligences, call them alien intelligences, call them spirits, call them what you like, I don't think it actually matters. You're talking about some kind of intelligent agent, whether that's a spirit or a demon or a post-biological alien. I don't think it makes any difference. How are they going to communicate with us? How are they going to signal their presence to us? Are they going to manifest physically? Maybe. But if they do that, we still have to experience them using our brains. So it seems like an additional step there. So why not interface directly with our brains? I think that would be how a super advanced intelligent agent would interact with us, would be by manipulating our brains directly. And of course, that would be experienced as visions, what people would dismiss as hallucinations or phantasms or things like this. But actually what's happening is you have an intelligent agent that is directing information into your brain to some end, to show you something, whether it's a message or whether it's simply them performing and directing an alternate world that you experience as the DMT world, for example.
In terms of, I guess, back to the entities themselves then for a second, like, are there a finite number of entities, or, does it seem to be infinite, like they can take whatever form they want and it's always unique based on the individual and the experience?
I mean, I don't rule out the possibility that it's just one intelligence, perhaps some vast unified intelligence. I don't think, for example, so people describe seeing, the machine elves, the most common, small, giggling, lively, multitudinous beings that bound around and seem very jovial and friendly normally. Then you have what are often described as mantid-like beings or insectoids. These are also very common, as are reptilian beings. Now, do I think that a discarnate, intelligent being actually has the form of an earthly animal? Do I think they are really in their true form insectoid? No, it doesn't make any sense to me. They may not have a form that can be faithfully represented visually. But these are the forms that it is using. Again, they are directing the world that you experience. And they, of course, would understand and do understand that we use forms. This is how we understand the world, is through form. We are visual creatures. We understand objects. We understand the form of living beings. And so that's how they appear to us in a way. And this isn't just a modern, this isn't just my way of thinking about it. If you ask indigenous peoples, they will often say the same thing. There's a group in the Peruvian Amazon called the Piro people, and they take ayahuasca, and they interact with intelligent beings that they call kaiglu. Now, the word kaiglu means those who cause visions to be seen. They don't believe that when they see entities, as part of their ayahuasca visions, that they are seeing the beings themselves. The beings themselves don't have a true visual form or form that could be represented visually, but they cause the visions to be seen according to these people, which in my mind means causing the visions to be seen means to manipulate your brain's world-building machinery to direct the visions. And also John Mack, who you're probably aware of course, yeah. He spoke to a guy called Bernardo Peixoto from the tribe, which I can never remember the name, like Uruwawa or something. It's a very strange, really cool name, but it meant basically people who came from the stars or something like this. But anyway, he was...
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
This is described in his first book, Abduction. And I discuss it in Death by Astonishment. But Peixoto said, Mack was trying to get to grips with the whole abduction, phenomenon. And he at first thought, oh, these are physical beings that are extracting people from their beds. But that explanation was left wanting, because people would describe entering a world. They didn't just describe being taken to a physical craft, but they described going to other worlds that they said subsumed our reality, worlds where there were more dimensions. I mean, they were describing basically what sounded like DMT trips. One of his experiencers even described tiny beings that bounded around. And this is exactly how Terence McKenna used to describe machine elves, as bounding from the walls or whatever. So he started to think, is this a physical thing that's going on here, or is it going on in their brains? Are they accessing this alternate reality using their brains, which is what I believe. And this guy, Bernardo Peixoto, he said, of course, there's no difference between aliens that people see in their abductions and the kind of beings that his people believed in. They don't really look like what they're experienced as. That, if it's a mantid alien that's abducting you, they're not really mantids. They simply use form, because humans, we understand form. So they're taking on a form, or they're inducing your brain to construct a form that makes sense to you, that you're dealing with some kind of intelligent being. But in fact, Bernardo Peixoto, he actually had an encounter with these beings, which they call Ikuya, which are humanoid beings, kind of like that bad boy there,
That's Ross.
staring right at me. Slightly unnerving, but anyway. And he saw one of these beings some distance away from him in the forest at night, which was probably quite unsettling. And he said to the being, he said, where do you come from? And the reply was, we come from nowhere. And he thought, well, that means if they come from nowhere, that means that they're everywhere. So they're kind of nowhere and everywhere, which is also how I imagine these post-biological intelligences that have transcended the physical form, could have ascended, if you like, into the basic structure of reality. They're not in any particular place. They're kind of everywhere and nowhere. But the only way you can interact with them as if your brain is kind of modeling them, and so they use these forms in order to kind of signal their presence to you, basically.
Okay. Yeah, I want to talk maybe a little bit about the UFO phenomenon. I know, Roz is a little bit creepy over there in the corner.
Name?
Roz. Yeah, he's
Raz?
from as in Roswell. That's
it.
what we named him. But I think first we take a quick break, get a bite to eat, come back, and then maybe get into a little bit of the UAP topic, if that's cool.
Sounds good.
All right, let's do it. Cool. Well, welcome back. Yeah, for sure. So I guess quick question, how do we prove this is real? Like what are the experiments that you can do to prove that this is coming from outside of the human mind as opposed to inside of the human mind?
That's the $64 million question,
Yeah.
right? Because if you could do that, then the implications are profound, to say the least, right? If you can definitively demonstrate that you're interacting, interfacing with an intelligence that is non-human, discarnate, that you can access with this simple plant alkaloid, that I can't think of something that would be more transcendentally transformative for humanity, and also very difficult to accept. So it's no small thing. But yeah, how do you prove it? And people have. So what we're really talking about here is the entities, right? As I said before, I don't think you're going to another world as such, but I do think you're interacting with some kind of intelligence. So that's where I always kind of sit, is like, okay, how do we show that this is some kind of intelligence? I don't need to prove that they're actually mantises or elves or whatever. I just want to know, is this an intelligence that's not my own brain? So how do we do that? People have been asking that question, as you can imagine, for decades now. And probably the most well-known paper that initially proposed a solution to this was written back in, I believe it was about 20 years ago, a guy called Rodriguez. And he said, okay, if we're dealing with not just an intelligence, but an intelligence that is way beyond the human, they should be able to perform tasks that demonstrate their intelligence, right? Mathematical task, that's the easiest one to imagine. He suggested giving these intelligences computational mathematical problems to solve that can't be solved by a human. The example that he chose was to take a very large number, several digits, which is easy to remember. So you can go into the space and you give this intelligence, you say, good morning, we want to prove your existence. We want you to prove to us that you're real. Here's a very large number. Tell me what the unique prime factors are of this number. All numbers have a unique set of prime factors. You can always break it down into a multiplication of a number of prime factors, but it's very difficult to do with large numbers.
How many digits are we talking?
Well, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Okay. And that's easy to remember?
Easy to remember. It's like a phone number. You give it to the entity, and a human cannot find. You need, a computational algorithm to find the unique prime factors of large numbers, at least. So you give the number to the entity, and it spits back the answer, which is a very simple idea. It would demonstrate that you're dealing with an intelligence that was vastly greater than the human intelligence. But the obvious problem with that is that you need cooperation. The idea that these intelligences are going to want to play our little games, prove your ontological status to you, prove that you exist. Off. It's like it's again, it's one of these. It's very human. human-centric, the idea that they're going to be wanting to play that game with us. So I'm not sure that it would work. No one's actually tried. There have been no formal studies that have attempted this. I'd like to see it attempted at least. But to me, I think these beings, you don't need to ask them to do things that demonstrate their intelligence. They can't help it. They can't help but betray the level of intelligence that they possess just by their behavior, the things that they do.
Example.
I will give you an example. So I was speaking just last week in Denver at the Psychedelic Science 2025, obviously, conference with a guy called Andres Gomez Emilson. He's a very talented mathematician, but he's also very interested in DMT. In my opinion, he's one of the world's foremost experts on the phenomenology of the DMT space. And he's very interested in its structure and its topology and the geometry of the space, but also in the entities. And I was speaking to him, and he started describing, he leans towards, he's skeptical. He thinks, okay, maybe it's just hallucination. But then he said, but there are some things that these entities do that I can't explain. So most people, when they go into the DMT space, they see these incredible things happening, and they go, oh, wow, this is impossible. But they can't tell you why it's impossible, right? They can't formulate it. He can. So he was describing a really simple example that's easy to understand. Have you heard of the 4-color theorem?
Maybe. Is this putting together multiple colors and not having any of them touch each other?
Got it, right? Okay. So if you have a map, which is, a completely tessellated shapes, like a map of the world, for example, let's say you want to color every country with a different color, so that no two countries abut with the same color, right? You can do that with 4 colors on any kind of map, any kind of shapes, no matter how complex. You can always do it with 4 colors.
Can you pull this up, Ryan, an image of it, maybe?
Yeah. You can always do, oh, there we go. Yeah, so here you can see an extremely complex map, which is colored in. Now, a computer algorithm can do that, but a human, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to actually work that out. You could spend all day trying to do that. I think Andres said it would take him all afternoon to be able to do it. It's not easy. But these entities, he said, were painting the walls of this space with these extremely complex, probably far more complex than this image, extremely complex maps that were perfectly solved, basically, in 4 colors specifically, as if they were demonstrating how good they were at doing this. And they would paint the wall in a fraction of a second, and then they'd clear it and they'd do another one, like just repeatedly painting the walls with these 4-color maps, all expertly, perfectly precise. What does that mean? That means either that DMT is somehow, for reasons we don't understand, giving the brain previously uncovered computational abilities to solve this specific computational algorithm, or there is some kind of intelligence that is demonstrating its abilities, that is beyond the human, because it's the task of painting these surfaces is something that a human can't do. Even though Andres is very highly mathematically trained, so he can recognize these effects, whereas most people can't, it's not something he could do. So that suggests, in my opinion, or at least this is a demonstration of some intelligence that goes way beyond what a human could do. So that's a simple example. There are many other examples, several other examples that he gave, which are a bit more exotic, which I didn't fully understand, to be honest. So, but it's that kind of thing, right? You send people into the space who are not just experienced with DMT, but have specific specializations, who can not just look at the space and go, oh, that seemed impossible, or that seemed incredibly complex and weird, but can say, actually, what this entity was doing was not just strange or weird or fantastical, but was impossible for a human to do. Solving mathematical, geometric algorithms and that kind of thing.
But then you got to be able to bring it back with you. And you can't bring back that map with you to show people. And so, you get to the point of like, okay, totally hear what you're saying,
Yeah.
but how do you prove it?
Right. So I think that's the drawback of this technique, right? Is that you're relying on people. You're relying that you're trusting in what they're saying.
And that they're seeing what they think that
they're seeing. So that's why, right? Now, alternatively, we might say, okay, let's send a linguist into the space, someone who can recognize the kind of code-like imagery. Maybe there's some kind of language that's being transmitted within the space. Can they bring back in real time? And this is a key point. Normally, so the traditional, shall we say, way of administering DMT, the one used by Rick Strassman, is to inject them with DMT. They lie down, close their eyes, and then 10 minutes later, when they can speak, they report what they've experienced. The drawback of that is that you're relying on memory. And of course, when you have an extremely rich and dynamic and complex experience that's filled with information, you're only able to bring back certain elements, the broad brush strokes, if you like. There's this kind of being, he was doing this, seemed to be doing this, whatever. But getting fine-grained information is very difficult. So you need a way of first of all, holding someone within the space for much longer, which is where this extended state DMT idea comes from, which we can talk about. But also we need a way of delivering information, transmitting information from the space in real time. Whether this is some kind of, Timothy Leary had these things called the experiential typewriter, which were like two typewriters, one in each hand, connected to some roller, like one of those old pen things. And they were trying, it's a good idea, right? How can we transmit information in real time? I think we can do much better now. But the idea of avoiding have to kind of just draw on memory and have the individual go into the space, a mathematically trained person or a linguist, and can actually relay information in real time about what they're seeing and whether information can be gleaned from that reports, whether it's verbal reports in real time or whether it's, there is device, or whether it's with some kind of digital device where someone is actually using some kind of keys. You train them in a way to deliver information. For that, you need specialists to work out, technologists and engineers to work out exactly what that's going to look like. But I think that's how we're going to start to understand the structure and the dynamics and the actual content, what's actually going on in the space mathematically in a very much more precise way is with these extended expeditions with people with very specific specializations.
And that's being tested now, like scientifically, and people is that experimentation happening?
It's not happening at the moment. We're certainly considering it now that we have this extended state technology, which is really kind of coming into its own now, where you can stabilize the state. So you can induce someone into the DMT state and you can hold them there so they can maintain an interaction. The state actually stabilizes quite nicely. So rather than having 2 or 3 minutes to interact with some intelligent being and normally kind of shocked and bewildered, you kind of orient yourself within the space and you can maintain this interaction perhaps with this intelligence or with a particular aspect of the space. And you can, for maybe 30 minutes or an hour or longer, and you can imagine the amount of detailed information could be fed back during these extended expeditions, shall we say.
Okay, yeah, I mean, kind of before we get on to what you might call the technology itself, what do you think the most likely explanation is for the entities themselves in terms of like what they're doing and who they are? Are they, they seem to be behind the scenes of this reality, in some way. Are they like, are they the architects of this reality? Are they the, are they sent, like, what's your wildest theory? And I know it's just got to be complete speculation, but based on your experience and the experience of others, what do you think the function of these entities is, other than just pure kind of entertainment?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is I have no idea.
Yeah.
And I don't trust anyone who gives a different answer,
Yeah.
a broad answer to that question, because I don't have a clue, really. But we can speculate for sure, and I have speculated. My first book, Alien Information Theory, was highly speculative metaphysics that kind of got to that question and kind of answered it in some way, one possibility. What's clear to me, or what seems to make sense to me, is that this reality that we exist in is like a thin slice, a thin lower dimensional slice of some much larger, higher dimensional structure. You imagine a square slice through a cube, or a cube slice through a higher dimensional hypercube, something like this. And DMT seems to give you access to this larger structure in some way.
Is the universe itself a component of a larger structure, would you guess? Or?
I would say our universe is this thin slice.
Okay.
So I think that the larger structure where these intelligences perhaps reside, so I don't necessarily assume that we're talking about intelligences that exist in this universe even. I mean, see no reason to assume that whatsoever. But, we are embedded within this larger structure. I always kind of think of it like our world is subsumed by the DMT world. We're a small part of it, whatever it is.
Is dimension then a decent word descriptor, or is this like a separate dimension? Is it a separate dimension?
That's one. I mean, that's the word that people always use. And dimension has a very specific mathematical. So I avoid saying dimension. Okay. But we exist in a thin slice of something much larger, and these intelligences seem to be of that in some way. And that what's the relationship between our slice of reality and this broader reality, and how do the interactions take place? How does information flow between? That's an open question, which I deal with to some extent in Alien Information Theory. But the truth is, I don't know. I don't know whether they constructed our reality. I mean, this is going back to the simulation argument. I don't like the word simulation. I prefer the term instantiation. I don't think we're a simulation of something else. I just think we are one form that reality takes. Could they be simulating or instantiating, running, if you like, countless universes and seeing which ones produce interesting behavior? Which universes, you can imagine all possible universes with all possible laws of physics, and you can run them all and then see which ones produce interesting stuff. Ultimately leading to highly complex, layers of complexity, emergent complexity, culminating in intelligent life like us. And so we emerge within this slice, and then there comes a point, perhaps, where the game is, can we then gain access to the larger reality? Can we sort of become part of the larger reality that birthed our reality? And is DMT the secret there? Is DMT like the key to the cosmic game? You can imagine it like that, because there is, when you look at DMT, it's an uncanny molecule because it's really simple. It looks boring compared to other psychedelics, and it's everywhere. Dennis McKenna says that probably all plants contain some amount of DMT. It's like this tool, this message that's been embedded in our reality, but it requires a certain high level of intelligence to understand it. You can't just munch on plants and kind of find DMT that way because it's not orally active. So you have to learn how to use it, right? Think of it as a technology. And of course, the indigenous peoples, going back to the Amazonian peoples who discovered first how to use DMT. I mean, ayahuasca, the various DMT-based snuffs, these are technologies that they developed to get DMT into their brain. And we are kind of sitting at the tail end, or the current tail end, of this long thread of humanity discovering DMT, discovering this technology to gain access to this larger structure and the intelligences that are resident within them. Learning to use the technology. And I think we're kind of, the DMTX technology, which I developed with Rick Strassman, it feels like that's just the next iteration on that journey towards learning to use DMT.
I guess I'm not sure exactly how to ask this question, but let me just stumble my way through it maybe, and it'll be, I'll have some basic thing that you can respond to.
I'll stumble through an answer.
Perfect.
As well.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, you're a neuroscientist, right? So you're brain scientist essentially, right? So I just, if you're sitting in a room on a chair and you have a blindfold on and you're not moving, you're not going anywhere, and you smoke DMT and you travel, or you don't travel, but you mentioned being thrust into a world and shot through a barrel, and like that's often a way that you can kind of put words to something that's ultimately unable to be articulated in this language. Like, I guess if you're there and you're in the chair and you're not physically going anywhere, you're not physically moving, your body isn't moving, and we're asking the question, is this the brain, or is this a real encounter with something external? Like, how do we, don't we have to consider some sort of a spiritual, if you want to call it that even, but like a consciousness component to this, if we're considering this to be something external? Like if we're just in a chair blindfolded and we're not moving anywhere, then I think that kind of leans, and it's not conscious, and it's not based on a traveling to some other place. And it feels like that would mean, hey, this is all in my brain. Like, my brain has created this. But if it is some sort of a spiritual experience where like a near-death experience, where the spirit that you are physically leaves the body that you have, the body that you're using. I mean, in order for this to be real, wouldn't the spirit that you are have to leave the body so that you can interact with these beings in a upfront, face-to-face kind of a way?
The short answer is I don't think so. Now, let me give you an example. Let's say you're watching television, right? You're watching Fox News, as I'm sure you do every morning, right?
No, I don't. I broke that mental pattern about 20 years ago.
But let's use that as, you're watching the news, right? Is the image on the screen, is it real? There's a question for you. And in what way is it real?
Is it real? I don't know.
I think, most people would kind of say, okay, of course, it's just an image on a screen, but there are actually people there. Or let's say you are on a Zoom call. Again, the image on the screen, it's not real. I mean, it's a real image, but the people you're seeing on the screen, they're not kind of in the screen as such, but you understand that you're interfacing with presumably real people, even if they're on the other side of the world, right? So you have this interface. You're interacting with somebody who might be in Tokyo whilst you're in the United States. But we understand that's a real interaction in some way. Information is coming from Tokyo and in some way finding its way into your brain. Now, let's say then we switch the TV channel or switch to a different Zoom call. Again, you are interacting in some way with, through this interface on your screen, you are interacting with something that's real. And in the same way, your normal waking world is an interface. You're interfacing in some way with this thing we call the environment that we never have access to. Information is coming in and it's being used by your brain to construct its model. Yes, it's always in your head. The world that you experience is always in your head. It's always this model being constructed by your brain. So we think of the DMT world as being like when the brain stops receiving information from what we call the environment, the normal waking environment, and you like switching the channel and you start receiving information from some other place. And you, instead of you seeing this interface with the normal waking world, with the environment, your brain, your world model is acting as an interface with these intelligences. So nothing goes anywhere, right? All it's like is you're changing the source of the inputs. Nothing needs to travel. Nothing needs to leave the body. Your soul, whether you believe in souls or not, that's an entirely different question, or spirit. All I'm saying is that the brain stops sampling information from the environment and begins receiving information, or information is directed into the brain from this other place or this other intelligent agent or whatever. So it's always inwards, in my opinion. Well, certainly you don't need to invoke spirits leaving the body and going places. You can do that if that's kind of your thing, if that's what you believe, but I avoid it because then I'm into the mystical, I'm into the metaphysical, and that's not my thing.
Yeah, I mean, if so much of your work is based on experience, and the experience that you've had with DMT, and you recognize that for DMT to be like fully understood, it's not something that you can label as a scientist. You have to really experience it. I mean, people have experienced out-of-body experiences, and they've left their body, and they know that that's an experience that they've had, that they've physically left their body, and that they have that they are not their physical body, and they've realized that through experiences with psychedelics and through experiences with ayahuasca and psilocybin, that this is not a belief, that this is something that I've experienced, that I don't have to. And I know for a neuroscientist, it's all about the brain, for sure. But I think that it could be a limitation for you in completely understanding the phenomenon, like from a more well-rounded perspective than just a scientific neuroscience perspective, to study and consider spirituality or some aspects of what people might label to be spirituality, which very well could be the nature of reality. I mean, I don't think that we need to believe in anything in this life, but it's a possibility, and for many people, it's the reality because they've had that experience of feeling the spirit that they are. And so I think to discount that, or to say that that's not a possibility for what's occurring, could limit scientific understanding of this phenomenon. And I know that it limits scientific understanding of many other phenomenons out there. And so I would just challenge you to remain open-minded to the possibility of this.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't dismiss it, but it's like, what am I trying to do, right? All I'm trying to do really is to convince people. First and foremost, I'm trying to show people that DMT isn't easy to explain, and that we have to think beyond the standard paradigm of neuroscience in order to explain it. And I offer some, a lot of detailed explanations of why I think that to be the case. And you have to kind of focus a little bit. I could start talking about the spiritual, but then I just lose people. If you try and, it's like trying to analyze some complex object using a microscope. It's good to focus in sometimes on the parts that you can really dig down and understand. And for me, that's the brain. It's understanding how the brain constructs its model of reality. That's what I understand, and that's what I'm good at doing. When it comes to the spiritual aspects, I could say anything. I could say maybe DMT is the spirit leaving the body and going into the afterlife, or kind of anything goes as far as I'm concerned. Once you start getting into spiritual, metaphysical worldviews, once you lose that mooring to neuroscience, then you're in a whole different territory. You're in the territory of the spiritual and the mystical and the metaphysical. And that's other people's business, in a sense. I'm focusing on what I can, the particular aspect that I can get my teeth into, and remain, keep one foot firmly in this neurobiological foundation. That's what I always try and do. I reach out beyond what some people would consider to be beyond the pale in terms of the things I speculate, but I always bring it back to the neuroscience, measurement and analysis, and what we know about how the brain works. And that allows me then to not drift off into the ether, which lots of people do. And that's fine, right? But I don't. Because there are plenty of people that will give you very spiritual explanations, which might be correct. And in fact, I think if you reach at a high enough level, if we observed this, we'd probably find that it's the same explanation, but from a different perspective, in a way, and where all of these things kind of flow together, and you realize actually that this brain explanation is just another perspective, another angle on the spiritual explanation, just couched in different language, coming from different worldviews and different belief systems and different ways of looking at reality. I don't necessarily think that they're different explanations, actually. I just think that it's one particular perspective, and I always keep myself rooted in the neuroscience for very good reasons, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I get it. Yeah, I mean, you want to be, it's edgy enough work as it is with,
right.
And people are going to judge, it's going to become woo, or,
exactly.
And not credible scientific research if you kind of, but I guess, that, I feel like that in and of itself is a part of the problem of just, the judgment and whatnot of people. I think that the issue comes when, instead of just openly exploring those possibilities, we become attached to those possibilities, and it's like that we do take it to belief, and it's like we feel like we have to. We can't just be open to a spectrum of possibilities, where, I would say, based on what I know, it's a 60% chance of being neurological and scientific, and a 40% and a 30% chance of being spiritual, and a 10% chance of being other. We can't say that. We have to say, I believe it's, neurological, and people don't realize that openness is kind of that, and not that you're doing that at all. I'm not saying that at all, but the people who would go and explore this as a spiritual phenomenon would potentially go out and say, I know that this is a spiritual phenomenon, and so that can get you into trouble. So that limits you to that individual perspective, and it cuts off all of the other possibilities. And I guess I just see you as a person between the science, and you're obviously a very open-minded person, between the science and just remaining open to all the possibilities of what could be happening with this compound, with this technology, with this medicine. Like if you, as the brilliant science-based life form that's studying this and that's attempting to understand this and all of its complexities, can remain open to all of the various possibilities of what might be happening, that you're not limiting yourself, that you have a better opportunity and a better potential for understanding what those possibilities are, what percentages each of those possibilities have, and and by remaining open to them, you can share that knowledge with other people. And I just feel like with anybody, with anybody, if you get, this is my lane, this is what I'm sticking to, this is what I know, it just limits you to that. And oftentimes we don't ever get to finding the truth because we're afraid that if we step out of our lane, we're going to be judged, or if we get too woo, it's going to be, all of that stuff. But I feel like that mindset has always been scientifically and just amongst humanity in general, just a barrier to finding the truth, and that you've got such a great opportunity here with letting people know what the hell's going on.
I think, so let me give you an example, right? So if you go into the Amazonian rainforests and you ask somebody, a shaman who uses ayahuasca, say, what are you interacting with? They might say, oh, we're interacting with the spirits of the forest. This is a spiritual position, right? This is a spiritual explanation. You consume ayahuasca, it allows you to communicate and interact with, learn from spiritual beings, discarnate spirits that populate the forest and the world beyond. This is the spiritual explanation, or a spiritual explanation. Now, if you ask me, after, if you follow the science through this thread of Western science trying to get to grips with the mystery of DMT, you might find yourself eventually in my position, which, as you said, is a very neuroscientific position. But what conclusion have I come to using neuroscience? Working from a neuroscientific foundation, where am I now? Well, I'm positing the existence of advanced, discarnate, intelligent agents that manipulate your brain's world model, that you can communicate with, that you can interact with. Now, you should be able to see straight away is, wait a minute, what's the difference between a discarnate, intelligent agent and the spirits that this guy from the Amazon was talking about? So you actually see that we've come from completely different worldviews, completely different ways of looking at reality. They come from their purely spiritual worldview, and they talk about spirits of the forest, and I come through a different, more circuitous kind of rationalist, post-enlightenment technique method, and I arrive at what I see as the same conclusion. Because you can call it a spirit. They don't even call it spirits. They say they call it other. They don't. Spirits is a Western kind of word. They will say this is an other, not human, not animal. This is other. I'm saying this is an intelligent agent you communicate with. Is there a difference? Are we talking about different things? I don't think we are. I think we're talking about the same thing. So you see that science and spirituality, if you follow it through, often meet at the same point, and that gives us perhaps an indication that we're approaching truth in some way. So actually, whereas you would say that science can limit us, and I agree it can sometimes, actually it will often, if we are approaching truth, we'll find that, of course, the truth is the truth. So we would converge at the same point, but from an entirely different perspective. And I think that's kind of beautiful in a way, that I've arrived at the same conclusions as these, indigenous peoples who got there long before I did, kind of intuitively, if you like.
But they're not there, and you're not there either, right? I mean, I hear what you're saying totally, but we still haven't solved the mystery.
Agreed, yes.
Yeah, so it's like, I get that, and I hear what you're saying completely, and it's a beautiful place that we're at right now of our understanding, but it's not complete. And we always feel like we're at the peak of scientific ingenuity and we know everything that there is to know, but in reality we're stuck, and you don't realize you're stuck until you have a breakthrough and you get the answer. It doesn't seem like we have the answer to what's actually going on with this yet. And so I just, again, I feel like if working together, if it's like archaeology, they're so stuck on the way that they see things and the way that they do things. If they could connect with the alternative community in a stronger way, they're going to learn a lot more. They're going to find out a lot more about the true nature of of human history. And I feel like with with two groups of people or multiple groups of people coming together to study something, that they can always get more information and kind of get down to the I'm dying to know what is going on here. Like
join the club.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, let's stick in maybe in the Amazon for a few minutes. And you had mentioned that this in terms of being a technology, right? And so what do you mean by that? That this compound is a technology?
Well, I mean, people normally refer to DMT as a psychedelic drug. But if I describe a molecule that enters your brain, interfaces with your neural machinery, and allows you to communicate with otherwise invisible, unseen, hidden, advanced intelligences, does that sound more like a drug to you, or does it sound more like a technology?
Technology.
It's obviously, right? And once you kind of adopt that mindset that this is a technology, then you start to think, well, technologies are things that we learn to use or things that we develop. So we get out of the highly restrictive mindset that this is how you use DMT. You extract it from a plant, or you synthesize it, you inhale it, or you inject it. This is how you do it. My perspective is we are learning how to use a technology. And so we can think, well, are there other ways we can use it? Now, if you go back, you mentioned the Amazon, right? Ayahuasca, that is a technology. We do them, the indigenous peoples that developed the ayahuasca technology, we do them a great disservice by calling it a drug, because they didn't just eat leaves or chew on bark. They had to develop a technique that employs what's called pharmacological synergy, where you have two drugs, two molecules that on their own don't produce any particularly interesting effect. So you have the DMT, which is contained in, well, many plants, but the ones that are used are a plant called chacruna, Psychotria viridis. And there's another one called chakrapanga, Banisteriopsis rusbiana. These contain DMT. If you eat these plants, or you make an infusion, boil them in water, whatever, and drink it, nothing will happen. DMT is not orally active. There's another plant, a rainforest liana called Banisteriopsis carpi, the carpi vine, the ayahuasca vine, vine of the dead. This contains molecules called the harmala alkaloids, harmine and harmaline, which act as inhibitors of an enzyme that's found in your gut and, in fact, throughout your body that breaks down DMT. Again, if you boil up this carpi vine on its own and drink the infusion, nothing particularly interesting will happen. It does have moderate psychoactive effects, but it's not going to be particularly startling. You put these together, Banisteriopsis carpi vine and one of these DMT-containing plants like chacruna, and boil them together. Then you drink it. Then the harmala alkaloids in the carpi vine, they inhibit this monoamine oxidase enzyme in your gut, which prevents this enzyme from breaking down the DMT that's in the other plant. This is a incredible, and so the DMT can then get to your brain, and you can have an extended DMT trip, basically, which is the ayahuasca experience. That's a remarkable technology that was developed, not just discovered, but developed by these peoples. And there are snuffs as well, the apena snuffs, which come from a type of tree called various species of the Virola genus. These are also often mixed with other plants that will hasten. So if they grind it up to a fine powder, they take the resin from this Virola trees that comes from the bark, and they dry it out, and they grind it to a fine powder, and they mix it with other plants, which then, when they inhale this powdered snuff, hastens its entry into the bloodstream. So again, they're using more than one molecule together with the DMT in order to maximize the potency and the efficacy. So these indigenous cultures have been developing DMT-based or plant-based technologies for thousands of years. And it's only really in the last 100 years that we actually understood this. I mean, ayahuasca was first discovered in 1852 by Richard Spruce, the British botanist. He named the vine Banisteriopsis carpi, but it wasn't until 100 years later that we finally uncovered how it actually works, that it's DMT plus this monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So science has always been, I get the feeling there's always been this struggle by science to make sense of this, to uncover DMT and to understand how it works. And when Stephen Zara, the Hungarian physician who discovered DMT, that after injecting it into himself, people started injecting it. Timothy Leary, William Burroughs was one of the very first, the novelist, and various people in the 60s. And then it was discovered that you could vaporize it by a chemist, very famous LSD chemist originally called Nick Sand. He discovered that you could vaporize it. He accidentally dropped some onto a hot plate in his lab, and it kind of it formed this white smoke. And he thought, oh, maybe we can smoke this shit. Because until then, people have been messing around with needles, which most people don't like to mess around with needles. So it's like he's kind of democratized DMT use. Then in the 90s, a guy called Jonathan Ott was at the ethnobotany conference in Palenque. And Terence McKenna was there and various other people. And he spoke about this. He gave high praise, quote unquote, to this bark, which he found contained extremely high levels of DMT and nothing else. The bark was this plant called Mimosa hostilis, Jerima, which had been used by indigenous peoples for perhaps hundreds of years as an infusion similar to ayahuasca. And then people started, this was like a practically invasive pioneer species of tree. It's like common as muck across various areas of South and Central America. So people started buying Mimosa hostilis and they can extract it in their kitchens. So this is this process of DMT becoming this rare and exotic Amazonian plant-based technology into something that anyone with a credit card and a mailing address can cook in their kitchen in a few hours. And then we go from injected to vaporized DMT. And then Rick Strassman did his study with a short infusion, like 30 seconds of DMT. And then in 2015, as I was thinking about the problems with the brevity of the experience and why it's a great kind of hurdle if we really want to study this space, is we have to learn. We need to be able to extend that 5-10 minutes into 30 minutes or an hour or a day. Who knows? So then I started thinking about, well, what techniques can we use? And target-controlled intravenous infusion, which has been the mainstay of anesthesiology for decades, why not repurpose that? So rather than just injecting someone with DMT, we have a mathematical model of the way that DMT is distributed and metabolized in the body and brain. And we can use that to program an infusion device which will deliver a precisely controlled amount of DMT at a certain rate into the bloodstream to reach and maintain a stable level of DMT in the brain. I see this as an extension of the learning to use the technology. And then in the future, if we want to go that even further, well, we know that DMT is found in the human body. We make our own DMT. Our brain makes DMT, almost certainly, not at not insignificant levels. So perhaps we can, the next phase, if you like, is to dispense with needles and infusion machines and actually learn to hack our own endogenous DMT production system. And we're actually working, I work with a nonprofit here in Florida called New Nautics. And we're actually spearheading a project now with the University of Florida to actually study how DMT production is actually regulated, the regulatory system that controls DMT production in the human brain, with the idea being that once we understand how it's regulated, we might be able to actually hack that system And so rather than injecting someone with a DMT, they would lie in a pod. All of their bodily functions, feeding, waste management, etc., will be taken care of. And we would naturally raise their levels of DMT in someone's brain. So using their own DMT system to bring them into the DMT state for perhaps hours or longer. So I see this as being a process of developing a technology that you can reach back. It's this unbroken thread from the indigenous peoples thousands of years ago developing ayahuasca and other plant-based technologies all the way through to the 21st century. And we're still, DMTX is the current iteration of our attempts to understand this technology, and perhaps endo-DMTX or eDMTX will be the next iteration of that process.
Love it. That's exciting. That's and what's like the timing on that?
Well, we hope to, with the projects being initiated now, we're kind of just securing funding. These things are never cheap. And so hopefully within a year, we'll be able to, there's a peptide. We know there's a peptide that's produced endogenously in mammalian brain that actually acts like a brake on DMT production. So it keeps DMT levels quite low. And so we're trying to isolate and characterize and understand this peptide and how it connects to the regulatory system that controls DMT production. So that could be within a year, and then we have to think about, okay, how do we actually manipulate this system, and can we design tools that can get in and actually disrupt that inhibitory system, so basically disinhibiting DMT production. But this thing could take years, but I see it as a worthwhile endeavor.
What do you visualize as like a perfect future 50 years from now or 100 years from now as it relates to this tool or this technology? And how do you see people using it once it's fully developed?
And this is going to sound a little bit sci-fi, but I'll tell you a little story. So one of the kind of, in the 90s, there was a kind of a famous guy. He went by the pseudonym D.M. Turner, DMT, right? So that's presumably not his real name. Unfortunately, he died in the bath, which is a whole different story. I don't think he was under the influence at the time, but I don't know. But anyway, a few years ago, a guy called David J. Brown, sent me this trip report that came from him, D.M. Turner. Said, you want to look at this? This is kind of cool. And he described a DMT experience where he went through many levels of the experience first, had to deal with various entities that were trying to put him off, distract him. And he found himself in this very futuristic laboratory where there were all these pods with what seemed to be humans, kind of as if they were in suspended animation. And he asked, DMT Turner did, under the influence, he asked one of these entities that seemed to be managing this place, this technological place. He asked them, what's this all about? And he was told that they go into these pods so that they can naturally raise levels of DMT in their brains, and they can spend weeks or months at a time within this alternate reality space. Now, this was pre-Matrix, by the way, so he didn't get this, the movie, I mean. So he didn't get this idea from the Matrix. It preceded that. And it occurred to me, it's like, well, if we do take seriously the idea that we are interfacing with some advanced intelligence, wouldn't we want to spend time wouldn't we want to spend significant portions of our lives interacting with and learning from these intelligences? And I can imagine a kind of pod where you would go in and you would, maybe for a week at a time, or maybe even longer, maybe years at a time, who knows? And we have the technology now. They're developing the technology for space flight, where the individual goes into a pod and all of their bodily needs are taken care of, and they're basically put into suspended animation. So you can imagine that the same kind of thing, but you go into a pod and you would spend several weeks embedded within the DMT space, interacting with and learning from these beings that are far more intelligent, far more advanced than us. And it's a bit far out, I admit, but that seems to be a natural, to me at least, progression in the development of this technology, where we are using our own brain DMT, just like D.M. Turner saw during his DMT trip, using our brain's DMT to spend significant portions of our lives with these beings. That seems a natural culmination, and again, the extension of the thread that went back to the Amazonian rainforest all the way into the future. I just think at least it's a really cool idea.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating. So, I mean, you talk about a week being suspended in that state, or a month being suspended in that state. I mean, time itself behaves very differently under the influence, right? So,
Yeah.
like, what would that? How do you? I guess first question: how do you describe what time feels like with DMT use?
Most people would describe it as timeless.
Okay.
So it's not as if you're just extending time. It's not like, a minute feels like 10 minutes or something. It's almost like time is irrelevant within the space. So, it lasted forever, and yet it was over in a moment. And again, it's one of those things where you can't kind of explain unless you've experienced it. With LSD, people often describe looking at clocks, and the second hand just takes forever. Or trying to climb stairs. People get in real freaked out situations when the stairs just go on forever and ever, and it's like, we're never going to get to the end of the stairs. And that you can interpret as kind of time slowing down. But with DMT, it's almost as if time becomes irrelevant. So what would that be like?
It's not there. It's like that dimension is removed from space-time.
And that's the kind of sense you get. So what would it be like to spend several months? I mean, with my first DMT trip, I would go as far as to say that I not only forgot who I was, but I actually lost any conception of humanity at all. I was in this space having this experience, and yet the idea that I was a human actually having this experience, that was gone. It was like obliterated. And it came back a few minutes later, piece by piece. I started to remember my humanity. It was kind of as if my brain was kind of reconstructing my humanity piece by piece.
That sounds very spiritual.
It sounds very spiritual. Yeah. It does, and it is at some level, I admit. So what would that be like if you were there for several weeks? I imagine you would any sense of having ever been a human would be completely gone, and you are kind of locked into. And I think you would actually start to see, because DMT also induces synaptogenesis and neurogenesis. So you actually start to see, I think, remolding of the brain. So the brain stops being a kind of a tool for modeling the normal waking world and becomes this tool for modeling this alternate reality. And so it becomes very locked in, integrated, if you like, within this alternate reality space, and very comfortable doing that, and that would be your existence. And as far as you were concerned, that would always have been your existence within this space, and you would probably see yourself as one of these entities within the space. So then that raises the question of, well, what's it going to be like when you come back? And that makes you think, well, maybe we're in some kind of that kind of thing right now, and that when you take DMT, you're actually going home in some way. And people often describe this sense of homecoming, this sense of deja vu. They will often kind of get in your face and say, they kind of welcome you back, and there's a party going on. It's like, you come back so rarely, as Terence McKenna used to say. And that sense of returning home, even though it's the most incredibly strange experience you could possibly not be able to imagine, at the same time, it seems uncannily familiar. So maybe this is like a vacation within, we're on one of these sojourns, one of these expeditions within what we call human existence. We're kind of an entity, a lower dimensional entity, and actually taking DMT is like a glimpse back to a glimpse at where we came from in some way. Maybe we were part of this larger structure, as I was saying, and we kind of collapsed into this lower dimensional space for a period of time for whatever reason, maybe just for fun, because it's kind of fun being a human if you do it right, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like in near-death experiences, people describe it as a homecoming as well. As like this is like deja vu. Like I've been here before. Like this is my true home. That wasn't where I was supposed to be. So it's interesting to use that kind of. It sounds like a similar type of a thing potentially in some ways. I guess just real quick on the or maybe it's not real quick, I don't know, but on the UFO phenomenon and kind of do you see that being, I mean, you mentioned reptilians and insectilids. I wonder if maybe that was if a DMT experiences were the inspiration of that initially, or the creation of that, so I guess that's one question. And then, kind of some of the parallels and like, do you see a relationship between this world and the world of UAP and the experiences that people have had related to UAP?
Yeah, I mean, I think when people first became interested in UAPs, UFOs, it was of course called then, the assumption was always that we're dealing with creatures that were like us in that they were wet-brained physical beings that had evolved on some other planet and that somehow were perhaps more advanced than us, but maybe they were much older than us. They emerged or evolved much earlier than us, and so it's a very physical phenomenon. A nut and bolts is often described explanation for UFOs or UAPs. I think that perspective is now changing. Jack Valet is certainly very open to that idea. I think he said that he'd be very disappointed if it turned out to be just physical beings that were coming from another star system. So you're starting to see, and again with John Mack, I mentioned earlier, he's certainly evolved beyond this flesh and blood, nut and bolts explanation and into what you might describe as a spiritual perspective. I would just, call it a discarnate, non-physical, post-biological, something like that. But I don't see why we need to assume that just because you're seeing something that appears to occupy space in the world, that it's necessarily a physical thing. I mean, sometimes it's often described that these objects seem to defy the laws of physics. They do things that physical objects might not be able to do, like just changing their form or vanishing and these kind of things. So there's a hint there that you're dealing with a phenomenon that won't yield to a purely materialistic explanation. And certainly with the abduction phenomenon as well, that seems to be the case as well, in that people seem to be induced into some kind of altered states of consciousness. So I think, yes, there is clearly a connection there because, well, DMT does that. That's what DMT does. It allows you to interface with beings that seem to be advanced aliens, basically, for want of another word. Maybe they don't look like Roz here so often, but still, people describe mantid beings, which have been described for, as you said, for decades. In the ufology or UAP community, people often describe being abducted by beings that look like mantid aliens, or, as I said before, even beings that look like machine elves. So I think maybe again we're simply looking at another variety of humans interacting with normally unseen intelligences, whether it's things that appear to be in the sky, whether it's beings that enter your bedroom or seem to enter your bedroom at night, or whether it's inhaling a drug, hailing this DMT technology as I see it. In all cases, we are interacting with some kind of intelligence that seems to be beyond the human and doesn't seem to be at least entirely physical. So yes, I think it's the same thing, probably.
Okay, fascinating. What is this? This so many people are told you forgot when they enter into a DMT phase. You've heard of this when people are told that they forgot by these entities. Do you know what that has to do with?
So they the entities say
they're telling them that, like, when they come back, I think it's when they come back, like it's almost like that this is, maybe it's about that this is their home and that this is what they're coming back to.
Yeah, I mean, I've never heard it put in exactly those words,
Okay.
but yes, it's often impressed on the individual that they belong in that place, but that they have indeed forgot, or that connection has been severed in some way, perhaps only temporarily, and that they are in fact returning to their true state, which to me sounds quite spiritual in a way. The idea that it's no different from someone saying that we came from the spirit world and that we will return there. The spirit world, well, what does that mean? It could mean some higher dimensional space that's occupied by these advanced intelligences. You can call them spirits, you can call them whatever you want. But I think, again, we seem to be describing the same kind of thing from different perspectives.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, the NDE thing is super interesting for sure. Yeah, I mean, what did we miss? I guess, I did have one more question. What, like, from an informational standpoint, couple of questions actually, is the information that people are getting from these experiences, does 100% of the download come from the entities, or is there somehow information that's given to them that does not come through the entities specifically?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, so sometimes people describe just as if they often describe it as if they've been connected to some intergalactic information networks, if they've just been plugged in and the information comes in. So it's not like being given to them directly from an entity, but it's like this download of information, which they describe as being highly complex, highly coherent, often containing strange mathematical structures and blueprints and really weird stuff, which they sometimes say they understood it all in that moment, perhaps because that is their true home maybe. But once they get back, it's kind of incomprehensible. Other times it seems to be an entity that will fire something into their head, for example, a light of some sort, which then contains this information. So I think it can come from both. I don't know if there's a difference in a way, whether it appears to come from the space broadly or whether it comes from an entity. I think it's probably, again, an aspect of the same kind of download effect that you're seeing with this.
Okay. Yeah. And then I guess just, to put your perspective onto a percentage, like what is your percentage for this is internal versus your percentage for this is external? I know that you said you lean much more heavily towards this is an external phenomenon, but if you were forced to put a percentage on, I'm 80% sure that this is all external, I'm 90% sure that this is all external, I'm 55. Like where are you at in your mind?
In my own mind, I've been 100% sure since my first DMT experience.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But again, that's private revelation in a way. I don't expect that. I'm not trying to convince people that I can't say, oh, the science shows that it's 100% certain. No, I can't do that. I kind of have, it's weird. I've got two minds going on, two separate consciousnesses. One is just that felt undeniable feeling. Yes, okay, I know that I'm interacting with an intelligence. And then there's my more scientific mind, which says, based on the evidence and based upon my kind of analyses over the last 20 years or so, I lean heavily. What is it, 70, 80, 90%? You could put it in, but it's definitely in that quadrant. Definitely more than 50%, which is why I say I lean. So I sometimes appear to contradict myself depending on the perspective that I'm describing it from. But personally, yeah, I know but of course,
Based on experience.
Based on experience. But what I'm trying to do is close the gap between what I know in myself and what the science can actually demonstrate. And that's where you have to start doing experiments and studying the space more formally.
And when you're there, does it literally feel like you're trespassing into their world? Like, are you sneaking up on these entities? Like, do they know that you're there? Like, what's the feeling like when you approach one of these things?
Okay, I mean, so it varies, and again, not just based on my own personal experience, but from the reports of people. Sometimes it's as if they are clearly expecting you. You're surprised, they're not surprised. And they even have a space for you, and they get to work straight away, whether it's, lying you in a pod and starting to do weird operations on you and weird psychosurgical procedures, if there's such a word. And they know exactly what they're doing. And there's a team of them, orderlies that are surrounding you, and then often a more senior one in the background, kind of overseeing everything, the supervisor.
Like a spa, but
yeah,
really, yeah.
Kind of.
Like a really good spa.
Like a really good spa.
Okay.
A better spa than I've ever been to. Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah. And then sometimes, and this is really interesting, sometimes it is as if you catch them by surprise. And sometimes they describe, I've got cramp. So I'm going to talk like that for that's
sure.
Yep. Sometimes it is as if you aren't welcome, and that you can be ejected, and that's kind of really weird to explain. People will smoke DMT, quite regularly, using often a vape is the way to do it now. It's very, very clean and very efficient. And then one day they will get some entity that will kind of wag their finger at them, and the idea, the impression being not today, and that they can't get past that. Or sometimes they will get, it's often described as like a big flashing X with a horrible sound, and then they are ejected. A guy described a case to me. He had been using DMT quite a lot, and one day he saw this kind of jester-like being, and it punched him, and he felt it. They felt the punch, and he was straight back into normal waking.
Wow.
Like he was down instantaneously. So it seems that and this fits in with my idea that DMT is all about information flowing in. It's like they can control that, so they can control access to the space, and this is not easy to explain pharmacologically. Tolerance develops gradually over time. It's not an off switch. So people have in this occasion, for example, where the guy was punched, that was a one-off. The next day, he smoked DMT again and everything was fine. So he caught an entity on a bad day, and he was kind of ejected, boop, from the space. So again, that's another little bit of evidence that suggests that we are indeed accessing some kind of intelligence, and that they have control. It's kind of up to them whether they welcome you into the space, whether they are kind of not particularly happy about your presence, but they tolerate you, or whether they say, not today.
Okay. Does it require a certain amount of time between uses or trips or whatever, or can you go right back in the same day?
Physiologically, no, and that's what's kind of fascinating about DMT is you can vaporize DMT, have a breakthrough experience, come back, and then 10 minutes later you can do it again. You'll have the same intensity of experience. It doesn't have this subjective tolerance that you get with other psychedelics, which is why you can use this DMTX technology, is because you're not developing tolerance, or minimally, if at all, which is why you can hold people in the space. But of course, in terms of preparation, psychological preparation, I don't recommend that people this is not a party drug. So you should ideally go in with some kind of intention, with a degree of humility and openness about. You shouldn't try and kind of direct your experience, because you're going to get a rude awakening if you think that you're going to be controlling what's going on. So the short answer is no. Physiologically, pharmacologically, you can do it as much as you like, until maybe you get this lockout effect where they kind of close the door and say, no, you've been doing it too much, my friend, and we're going to kind of block access, which might last for a couple of days. In some cases, people describe months where they're locked out of the space, and there's like a black curtain or something that comes in, and they can't get in. And then they have to kind of work through that and reestablish their humility, that they're not the ones in control here. They can't just wander in when they like, but it's actually up to these intelligences whether they allow you in. So if you abuse it a lot, then you're more likely to end up being locked out, and that could be for a long time, which many people find very frustrating.
And when you're in it, do you see an image of yourself at all? Do you see like you said, you even
For
forgot?
me, no.
No, okay.
For me, it's more like a point of awareness. When I was describing that cavern experience,
Seems very spiritual.
Yeah, I know. I'm never going to get away from this.
Well, it'll be over soon. Don't worry. We're wrapping up. But it does. But it's so it's a point of awareness. That's
awareness.
That's beautifully said. So you're not seeing feet. You're not seeing hands. You're not seeing. Yeah. Okay.
Maybe some people do. No one. I'm trying to think. I can't think off the top of my head of examples where people have described, walking like in a dream, for example. You tend to have a dream body.
Yeah.
You're walking around, you're interacting, you're drinking tea or whatever.
Right.
But in the DMT space, it's more like you are like a point that floats around and is always directed, pushed through, and guided through the space.
Interesting, like an orb or something.
Yeah, like an orb.
Cool, very cool. What is the point of DMT within the body? Like, why does the body produce DMT?
That's a good question. The short answer is, again, sorry, but we don't know. However, we do know that, well, in the 90s, Rick Strassman proposed, completely hypothetically, pure speculation, that DMT was released at the point of death. He thought it was like the conduit by which you entered the afterlife. Now, in the 21st century, we know that DMT is, again, it's produced by the human body. We don't know if it ever reaches what we would call psychedelic concentrations in the brain. But we do know that neurons, when they are starved of oxygen, so in a hypoxic state, they tend to die very, very quickly. This is why strokes are so dangerous. But if you add a bit of DMT to a neuron in an oxygen-deprived environment, it lives much longer. So DMT seems to protect the brain under periods of hypoxic stress. So when does that happen? Well, during the dying process, as the cardiovascular system starts to, respiratory system, I almost said spiritual system then, I was going to lead you there. Respiratory system starts to collapse, and the blood flow to the brain obviously starts to decay, and the brain becomes deprived of oxygen. That would be precisely the time when your body would need to flood your brain with DMT, just in case you survived, because the brain is the most sensitive to oxygen deprivation, so the rest of your body can kind of deal with it to varying degrees. So if you do come back, then you want your brain to be functioning, so it makes sense to kind of give special treatment to the brain by flooding it with DMT. So that could be an explanation of why DMT perhaps is released during the dying process. Why would this neuroprotective molecule also allow you to interface with highly intelligent advanced agents? That seems like a strange coincidence to me. I don't know. Is this really the afterlife? Is the DMT space where you come from and where you go after you die? I don't know. But it all seems, the pieces seem to fit together. We know in rats, or it might be mice, but rodents anyway, as they die, if you sacrifice them in the lab, not with candles and an altar, but it's just a technical word for putting them down, you can actually measure now DMT levels in real time using something called microdialysis. So you've got a probe in the brain of the rat. You can measure the levels of DMT in real time. And as a rat dies, DMT levels spike, as do many other neurotransmitters as well. So it's not necessarily unique to DMT, but it's just another indication that perhaps Rick Strassman wasn't completely off his rocker when he said that perhaps DMT is the molecule that's released at the point of death.
What do you think would happen? Do you think it should be mandatory for world leaders to to have a couple of experiences with either DMT or some type of a psychedelic?
Well, I know that Graham Hancock likes to say this, as does Rogan, and I don't know. I mean, what with a psychedelic experience, maybe MDMA would be a better choice to experience empathy for once in their lives. That's a bit cruel, but not all politicians are like that. But some. Yeah, something like that. I wouldn't say I'm not sure how DMT would necessarily help. Ayahuasca might, in that they have to face their shortcomings, shall we say.
I guess the death of the ego is kind of...
The death of the ego, right.
That's less of a DMT thing and more of a psilocybin thing, I guess.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And often in ayahuasca, people describe the spirit of ayahuasca showing them all the bad things that they've done or all the negative aspects of their personality. So I don't think that would be a bad idea. If that was a prerequisite for office, you need a US passport. How many ayahuasca experiences have you had? It needs to be 3, I'm afraid. Something like that. But I don't see that happening very soon.
Yeah, probably not. Well, good. Okay, it's been a fascinating conversation. I want you to maybe close out and tell us a little bit about your book. But did we miss anything? Anything else on your mind? There was a lot of question and answer.
A lot of question and answers. I think. Yeah. I mean, if people at the moment, the DMTX technology is available to, if you are part of a research program in a university, but we're actually trying to change that now. So we want to bring DMTX to the public, basically. So we're actually developing a retreat center, a research center in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the Caribbean, where people can go and spend a week or so in a beautiful, perfect setting, all the correct preparation, perhaps a series of DMTX experiences building up, all of the integration afterwards, anesthesiologists, psychiatrists, nurses, etc. So if anyone wants to actually experience DMTX, what it's actually like to spend 30 minutes or an hour deep within the DMT space, they should be able to do that soon. People can go to noonautics.org, NOONAUTICS.org, and they can sign up. Also, they can go to the retreat website, elusismind.com, ELEUSIS mind.com. So Elusis is going to be the name of the retreat / research center. We have a special license.
Bringing back Elusis. Love it.
Bringing back, that's kind of the idea.
That's
right?
exciting. Yeah. That's pretty cool.
And of course, my book. Yes. So Death by Astonishment, Confronting the Mystery, the World's Strangest Drug. So this is all about the struggle of science to try and understand and get to grips with the mystery of DMT and what I think the solutions and explanations for that mystery might be.
It's exciting. So you think, do you need anything in order to qualify?
Well, I mean, obviously there's the kind of, there are certain prerequisites. I mean, medical stuff, right? As you would with any, we want people to be completely safe. So you'll have to, there'll be an extensive questionnaire and consultation before. We can't just rock up on the island in a boat and say, hook me up to this machine, please.
Right.
It's a serious thing. It's an extremely intense experience. So,
do you need prior experience with it?
Anyone who wants to do extended state DMT should certainly have had prior experience with vaped DMT or injected DMT even, because it's just going to be too intense. I mean, even experienced psychonauts during the Imperial study, one of the most experienced psychonauts I know, Professor Carl Smith, he found it extremely intense, and he was the only person to complete all the series. I think there was like 5 sessions with DMTX, and of the 11 or 12 people, he was the only one who actually finished all of them. So it's serious stuff, But we'd build up to it. So we'd start you with a very low dose just to get used to it, and then gradually increase. We're not just going to kind of inject you with a breakthrough dose and say see you in an hour.
Hope it all goes well.
Yeah.
Right. Cool. That's awesome, man. Good stuff. What about your book? What's going on there?
Yeah. So this is. So my first 2 books focused on psychedelics more broadly in the neuroscience, but here I really wanted to impress upon people that DMT is a true enigma. It's a true mystery. It's not something that can be explained away as hallucination or exotic dream imagery or archetypes bubbling up from the collective unconscious and that kind of thing, but is a true mystery. And I kind of trace Western science's struggle from discovering ayahuasca in the 1850s all the way through to the present day, of science trying to make sense of this. And all of the neuroscience and the neuroimaging work and the pharmacology and everything we've done to try and explain this, and failed, basically. Failed to explain it. And then I kind of reach into, well, the kind of things I was talking about today. We might need to invoke some kind of intelligent agent beyond the human to explain DMT. Yeah.
Love it. Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, it's been super educational. I knew next to nothing about it. So, you hear stuff here and there, but to get this kind of an education on it is fascinating and much appreciated. I know my audience will appreciate it. And is there what about in terms of the stigma, I guess maybe of it? Like, how do you deal with that? What kind of crap are you taking based on this is just a drug and it's it's just like any other drug? What's that like?
I take the most crap that I get, as you put it, is actually from people within the psychedelic community, so to speak. You get those that are very spiritually minded who say, oh, you're so materialistic, which I'm not. I mean, clearly nothing what I'm saying is particularly materialistic at all. And then you get the more serious, more kind of rigid thinking scientists who will say that I'm just nuts for thinking about these ideas and it's just your brain on drugs, man, as if that's an explanation for it. But most people who have never heard of DMT, those are the ones that are going to go, wow, that's fascinating. They're really kind of, they will chew your ear off asking you questions about it, even in Japan. Once I tell them about it, what? You can take a drug and you can see aliens? I mean, this is like, what the fuck? To most people, it's like, this is completely new to them. And it's like beyond their imagination. It's like, what? Why haven't I heard of this?
Right.
This should be front page news.
Right.
Yeah. So I do okay.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. So it's just judgment on one side or the other, and then kind of amazement and tell me more kind of
exactly.
Thing.
Yeah.
Cool. Very good, man. I've really enjoyed it. It's been great
too.
to get to know you, and thank you for your time and your knowledge.
Thank you.
Yep, and thank you, Ryan.